The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Benning training grounds as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her Kevlar vest one final time. Today marked the beginning of the interspecies military exchange program, humanity's first joint training exercise with their new alien allies, the Valorians. After 2 years of diplomatic negotiations following first contact, both species had agreed to share combat techniques and defensive strategies. Sarah had volunteered for the program, despite the skepticism of her commanding officers. At 5'4" and 125 pounds, she was hardly the imposing figure they'd wanted to represent human military prowess. But her record spoke for itself. Top marks in close-quarters combat, expert marksmanship, and a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that she'd earned during her off-duty hours. The Valorians emerged from their transport vehicle like walking monuments. Commander Thexkar stood nearly 7 feet tall, his scaled hide gleaming bronze in the sunlight. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world where physical strength determined survival. Their bone density was triple that of humans, and their muscle fibers could generate force that would make a silverback gorilla seem weak. Primitive training facility, Thexkar observed to his subordinate, warrior Cephalon, as they surveyed the obstacle course. These humans barely possess natural weaponry. No claws, no enhanced bone structure, no protective scales. How did they survive their planet's evolution? Colonel Martinez, the human training commander, stepped forward with a diplomatic smile. "Welcome to Earth, Commander. We're honored to learn from your combat expertise." "Indeed," Thexkar replied, his translator rendering his words in perfect English. "Though I confess curiosity about what your species might teach us. Your physiology suggests you rely entirely on tools and technology." Sarah bristled at the condescension, but maintained her composure. She'd grown up as the smallest person in every room, constantly underestimated by classmates, drill instructors, and even fellow soldiers. Her entire military career had been built on proving that assumptions about size and strength were dangerously incomplete. The first day consisted of demonstrations. The Valorians showed techniques that utilized their natural advantages: bone crushing, grapples, armor-piercing strikes, and defensive postures that could withstand tremendous force. Their movements were powerful but predictable, relying on overwhelming strength rather than finesse. When the humans demonstrated their techniques, focusing on leverage, speed, and precision targeting, the Valorians watched with polite but obvious skepticism. To them, human combat looked like elaborate dancing, pretty but impractical against a truly dangerous opponent. "Tomorrow, we will begin joint exercises," Thexkar announced. "Perhaps we can show you more effective methods." Sarah caught the subtle insult and felt her jaw tighten. She'd spent years proving herself against human opponents who underestimated her. Now she faced an entirely new species with the same prejudices, magnified by actual physical superiority. As the sun set over the training grounds, Sarah practiced her forms alone, muscle memory guiding her through combinations that had become second nature. Tomorrow, she would represent not just herself, but her entire species. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like familiar armor. The second day began with paired exercises. Colonel Martinez had carefully orchestrated the matchups, pairing similar-sized opponents to minimize the risk of injury. Sarah found herself assigned to work with warrior Cephalon, Thexkar's second in command, and the smallest of the Valorian delegation at a mere 6'6". "Defense against rear grabs," Sergeant Morrison announced. "The attacking partner will simulate a restraint hold from behind. The defender will demonstrate appropriate countermeasures." Sarah watched as the first pairs went through the exercise. The Valorian techniques were brutally effective. They simply powered through restraints using raw strength, often lifting their attackers off the ground entirely. The human techniques relied on joint manipulation, leverage, and redirecting. Force rather than opposing it directly. When Sarah's turn came, she stood ready in the center of the training mat. Cephalon approached from behind, his massive frame casting a shadow over her petite form. Several onlookers chuckled. The size difference was almost comical. "I will be gentle, little human," Cephalon said, his translator conveying what he intended. As kindness, but came across as patronizing condescension. "I'm a lieutenant in the United States Army," Sarah replied quietly. "Not a little human." Cephalon's expression remained unchanged as he positioned himself behind her. In his mind, this was barely training, more like a demonstration of the obvious physical hierarchy between their species. His homeworld's gravity was nearly 3 times Earth's. His bone density could withstand impacts that would shatter human skeletons. "Begin," Sergeant Morrison called. Cephalon's arms came around Sarah's torso in what he considered a gentle, restraining hold. By Valorian standards, he was using barely 10% of his strength, enough to hold one of his own juveniles, certainly adequate for a human female. But Cephalon had made a critical error in judgment. He'd positioned his arms too high, across Sarah's chest rather than pinning her arms to her sides. He'd also failed to account for the fundamental difference in human defensive training, where Valorians relied on strength to break holds. Humans had developed techniques that exploited anatomical vulnerabilities. Sarah felt the alien's arms tighten around her, and every instinct honed by years of training kicked in simultaneously. Her body reacted before her conscious mind could process the situation. She dropped her center of gravity, creating space between her back and Cephalon's chest. Her right elbow drove backward in a sharp arc, targeting the solar plexus, while her left hand grabbed his right wrist. The combination happened in less than a second. As Cephalon reflexively loosened his grip from the elbow strike, Sarah pivoted to her right, using his own grip on her as leverage. Her shoulder drove into his armpit as she twisted, and her left hand yanked his arm down and across her body. The leverage was perfect. Cephalon's superior strength meant nothing when applied. In the wrong direction against a joint, it could only bend one way. His collarbone, dense as it was, had the same structural limitations as any bone when subjected to precise mechanical stress. The snap echoed across the training ground like a gunshot. Cephalon's bellow of pain and surprise silenced every conversation. He stumbled backward, his right arm hanging useless as he clutched his fractured collarbone. His face contorted with shock and agony emotions that registered clearly despite his alien features. Sarah spun around, her hands already raised in a defensive posture, adrenaline flooding her system. For a moment, she didn't understand what had happened. The movement had been pure reflex, executed with the precision of countless hours of practice. Then she saw Cephalon's condition and felt the blood drain from her face. The medical tent buzzed with activity as both human and Valorian. Medics worked to treat Cephalon's injury. The fracture was clean, but severe. The collarbone had snapped completely through, requiring immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Williams, the human chief medical officer, worked alongside healer Vexstar to ensure proper treatment for Valorian. Physiology. Outside the tent, Commander Vexkar paced with barely contained fury. His scales had darkened to a deep bronze, a sign of agitation that even the humans could recognize. The idea that one of his warriors had been injured by a human, specifically a human female, challenged everything he understood about combat. Capability. This was no accident, he growled to his aide. No creature that fragile could generate such force naturally. They must have enhanced her somehow. Colonel Martinez stood nearby, equally disturbed, but for different reasons. An injury during the first week of joint exercises could derail the entire program. Relations between the species were still fragile, built on mutual need rather than trust. Sarah sat on a bench outside the medical tent, her hands still trembling from residual adrenaline. She'd replayed the moment 100 times in her mind, analyzing every movement. The technique was one she'd practiced thousands of times, a standard self-defense counter that exploited leverage, asterisk, and joint mechanics. She'd never considered how it might affect alien physiology. Lieutenant Shun. Commander Thexkar approached, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. I require an explanation. Sarah stood at attention, though the top of her head barely reached his chest. Sir, it was a defensive reflex. I didn't intend to cause serious injury. Defensive reflex? Thexkar's translator made his skepticism clear. You expect me to believe that your species naturally possesses techniques capable of disabling trained warriors? With respect, sir, warrior training on your world likely emphasizes different priorities than ours. Explain. Medic, she shouted, her training overriding her shock. We need a medic. Sarah took a deep breath, recognizing the opportunity to represent her species accurately. Earth is a high predator environment. Humans evolved as persistence hunters, but we were also prey to larger, stronger creatures. Our survival depended on intelligence, tool use, and techniques that could neutralize threats regardless of size disparity. Primitive creatures do not develop such sophisticated combat techniques. Every human child learns basic self-defense. We have to. Our planet contains dozens of species that could kill us with raw strength, big cats, bears, even other humans. We developed martial arts that turn an opponent's strength against them. Thexkar's expression remained skeptical. You claim this is natural ability? It's learned ability based on natural advantages we do possess. Humans have exceptional hand-eye coordination, rapid reflexes, and joint flexibility that many species lack. We also have psychological advantages. We're used to fighting opponents larger and stronger than ourselves. Dr. Williams emerged from the medical tent, her expression serious. He'll make a full recovery, but he's going to need surgery and several weeks of rehabilitation. The fracture was remarkably clean, almost surgical in its precision. How is that possible? Thexkar demanded. The human applied force at exactly the right angle to exploit the natural stress point in Valorian bone structure. It's actually quite similar to human collarbone mechanics. The same technique would be just as effective on one of us. Major Patterson, the human training coordinator, approached the group. Commander, I've reviewed the footage from multiple angles. This was clearly a defensive reaction to what the lieutenant perceived as a threat. Her technique was textbook perfect, but there was no malicious intent. Show me, Thexkar commanded. They gathered around Patterson's tablet as he played the recording in slow motion. The sequence became clear. Cephalon's grip triggered Sarah's defensive reflexes, honed by years of training against larger opponents. Her technique was precisely executed, demonstrating the biomechanical principles that made human martial arts effective. This is your standard training? Thexkar asked. For military personnel, yes. Most human civilians learn basic self-defense, but military training is more comprehensive. Thexkar studied the footage again, his anger slowly giving way to professional curiosity. Your warriors train to defeat opponents with superior physical capabilities. Sir, on Earth, that's the only kind of opponent worth training against. Asterisk, the next morning brought an unexpected development. Instead of canceling the joint exercises, Commander Thexkar requested a private demonstration. He'd spent the night reviewing human military records, studying combat footage, and consulting with his own tactical experts. I have made incorrect assumptions, he announced to the assembled group. This requires correction. Sarah found herself once again at the center of attention, but this time the atmosphere was different. The Valorians watched with genuine interest rather than condescending. Amusement. Lieutenant Chun, demonstrate your combat techniques against multiple opponents. Dexcar ordered. Colonel Martinez stepped forward. Sir, we'd prefer to avoid further injuries. Understood. My warriors will wear protective gear and exercise. Restraint. But I must see the extent of human capabilities. What followed was a revelation for both species. Sarah moved through a series of demonstrations that showcased human martial arts principles, using momentum against opponents, targeting vulnerable points, and maintaining mobility to avoid being grappled. Each technique was designed to neutralize advantages in size, strength, and reach. Against padded Valorian opponents, Sarah demonstrated throws that sent warriors twice her size sprawling, joint locks that could disable limbs regardless of muscle mass, and strikes that targeted nerve, clusters, and pressure points. Her movements were economical and precise, wasting no energy on flashy techniques that wouldn't work against stronger opponents. Your species has weaponized physics itself, observed healer Vextar, who had joined the group to better understand. Human combat medicine. We had to, Sarah replied. Earth's evolutionary pressure created an arms race between predator and prey. Humans survived by becoming too dangerous to hunt, despite our physical limitations. Dexcar watched a demonstration of knife defense, where Sarah disarmed a Valorian warrior using techniques that relied on speed and precision rather than strength. These methods would be effective against any opponent, regardless of species. That's the point, sir. Good technique works because it exploits universal principles: leverage, balance, momentum, and anatomy. Every creature with joints and bones has vulnerabilities that can be exploited with the right knowledge. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, the human, close quarters combat instructor, stepped forward. Sir, Lieutenant Chun represents our standard training level. Every human soldier learns these techniques. In Special Forces, the training is much more intensive. Special Forces? Dexcar's interest was clearly piqued. Elite units trained specifically for combat against superior opponents. They specialize in techniques that maximize human advantages while minimizing our disadvantages. The demonstration continued with weapons training. Humans had developed fighting systems that accounted for their physical limitations, techniques that worked when tired, injured, or facing multiple opponents. Every movement was tested against the assumption that the opponent would be stronger and possibly better armed. Your training assumes you will face defeat if you fight fairly, Vexcar observed. Fair fights are for sports, sir. In combat, you use every advantage available. And what advantages do humans possess? Sarah considered the question carefully. Intelligence, adaptability, endurance, precision, and the willingness to exploit any weakness we find. We also have something most species lack: extensive experience fighting our own kind. Explain. Human history is full of warfare. We've spent thousands of years developing techniques to fight other humans who know all our weaknesses and capabilities. That created an evolutionary pressure for increasingly sophisticated combat methods. Vexcar nodded slowly. Your species has been forged by constant conflict. Yes, sir, but also by the need to survive against opponents that should have been able to defeat us easily. The final demonstration involved team tactics. Human soldiers showed how they used coordination, communication, and combined arms to defeat numerically superior or individually stronger opponents. The emphasis was on intelligence, planning, and execution rather than individual prowess. Remarkable, Vexcar murmured. Your species has developed warfare into a science. We've had to, sir. Individual humans are relatively weak, but humans, working together with proper training and equipment, can defeat almost anything. As the demonstration concluded, Vexcar gathered his warriors for a private discussion. The conversation was animated, with frequent gestures toward the human training areas. When they returned, His expression had changed completely. "I request permission to train with your methods," he announced. Asterisk. 3 weeks later, the joint training program had evolved into something neither species had anticipated. The medical tent had been converted into a research facility where human and Valorian experts collaborated on combat biomechanics. Cephalon, his collarbone healed and his pride somewhat restored, had become one of the most enthusiastic students of human fighting techniques. "The leverage principle is universal," he explained to a group of junior Valorian warriors. "Size becomes irrelevant when you understand the mechanics of joint manipulation." Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of instructor, teaching alien warriors techniques that had been developed to defeat stronger opponents. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same techniques that had been dismissed as inadequate were now being studied as potentially superior methods. "The key insight," she explained to a mixed group of human and Valorian trainees, "is that every creature has the same fundamental weaknesses. Joints can only bend in certain directions. Pressure points exist in similar locations. Balance depends on physics, not biology." Commander Thekskar had become an unexpected advocate for human methods. His own training had been revolutionized by concepts that his species had never considered. "We assumed that superior strength was the ultimate advantage," he admitted during a joint briefing. "But strength without technique is merely potential. Energy. Humans have learned to transform potential into kinetic force with maximum efficiency." The program had also produced unexpected diplomatic benefits. Working together to master challenging techniques created bonds between species that formal negotiations had failed to establish. Shared sweat and mutual respect proved more effective than treaties. "I owe you an apology," Cephalon said to Sarah. "During a break in training, I made assumptions about your capabilities based on prejudice rather than evidence." "We all make assumptions," Sarah replied. "The difference is whether we're willing to change them when presented with new information. Your species has much to teach us about adapting to disadvantage. And your species has much to teach us about utilizing natural advantages. The ideal warrior combines both approaches." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Valorian fleet. A crisis had developed on a frontier world where human colonists were under attack by indigenous predators. The local forces were overwhelmed, and reinforcements were needed immediately. "I volunteer for the mission," Sarah announced without hesitation. "As do I," Cephalon added. "This will be an excellent opportunity to test our new combined techniques under actual combat conditions." Commander Thekskar looked at the unlikely para, human female barely 5 feet tall and a Valorian warrior nearly 7 feet in height. 6 months ago, he would have considered such a partnership absurd. Now, he recognized it as potentially the most effective combat team either species had ever produced. "Approved," he said. "Show them what two species can accomplish when they stop underestimating each other." As the transport shuttle lifted off toward the frontier, Sarah reflected on the changes that had occurred since that first day of training. A simple defensive reflex had shattered more than just a collarbone. It had broken assumptions, prejudices, and limitations that both species had accepted as immutable. The snap that had echoed across the training ground 3 weeks ago had been the sound of two worlds changing their understanding of what was possible. Sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't strength or technology, but the willingness to challenge what everyone believed to be true. In the seat beside her, Cephalon practiced the joint manipulation techniques that had once seemed impossible for someone of his size and strength. Across the aisle, human soldiers tested Valorian defensive postures that could withstand tremendous force. The future, Sarah realized, would be written by those who refused to accept the limitations that others imposed on them. And sometimes it took an alien perspective to recognize capabilities that had been there all along. The transport accelerated toward the stars, carrying two species that had learned the most important lesson of all. Strength comes not from what you are, but from what you're willing to become. Asterisk.